Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back talking about Survivor South Africa Return of the Outcasts for the final video in my coverage of the season, where I'll be ranking every player from the season based on how I feel like they played on this season. With there being 20 players to rank here, let's just jump right into it. At number 20, the person I feel like played the worst game on this season does end up having to be Tanya. And for me, Tanya has kind of shown that she is debatably the worst Survivor SA player of all time for me. I will be honest, I don't have the greatest memory of a lot of the earlier boots of some of the earlier seasons, but certainly from Champions on, I do think Tanya is in serious contention for being the worst player of SA at this point. I mean, she was obviously the first boot from her tribe here in a position where she was a major source of conflict on the tribe, her along with Pinet, in a position where she could have very easily just let the Pinet situation go, but continued to just cause more conflict with her. But mixing this in with the fact that we saw her on Island of Secrets be in this very similar position early on, where she would have been the first boot had she not been saved by the Island of Secrets, again, for me, that puts her as pretty much a two-time first boot from her tribe now. And again, I do think there's a serious argument for her being the worst player to ever play. And again, when it comes to her game on this season, I will say that there is at least a sliver of credit to give her in the sense that there were people that did want to keep her around. The likes of Felix and Phil did want to keep her around. Even Tevin mentions the possibility of voting to save her if she was able to get the other votes herself. But really though, Tanya ends up being a mostly ineffective player here. One that isn't just bad at the game, but is also actively bad at the game. To the point where, again, like Tanya is an active player. It's not like she's not doing anything and it's just this easy first boot to be taken out. She's still actively doing things, and those things are harming her position on the tribe even more, even though she does come into the game with the inherent disadvantage of being on the older side and also seeming like the physical weakest figure there. So she does have these inherent disadvantages, but she doesn't do anything to help herself despite those advantages. And for me, I just feel like Tanya is one of the worst players we've seen. She's here at number 20. Now, number 19, the player she had conflict with, we have Pinet. And Pinet is a weird one here because, like, obviously Pinet makes a much deeper run in the season. I mean, Pinet technically outlasts 6 people on this season, and I will say that Pinet probably has more minor positives to point out than some of the people we're about to be talking about. But for me, Pinet still fundamentally is a player that I just cannot see winning this game. I think she is a player that, despite her seeming to have some decent reads at points and seeming to have a pretty strategic mind to where, like, she's not the worst strategist in the world, I do just feel like she is still pretty emotional in how she enacts this strategy, and is really just an emotional person to the point where she really can't hide how she feels about something that causes conflict with other tribe members. But it's despite this notion of her being this easy goat to beat at the end, the fact that they don't even drag her that far into the game, I think is an indictment on overall game ability here, especially when she is not this physical weakness like a Tanya, to where it makes sense why you would vote someone like that out early. With Pinet, if you're someone that's able to rein Pinet in, she seems like the perfect type of person to drag along in the game, especially if she's going to continue to cause conflict with other people. But for the likes of Tony and Tajin in particular, deciding to vote her out seemingly just due to the fact that she caused conflict around camp and not really for real game reasons, I do think is a bit of a knock for Pinet here. Now again, like, technically she did have a backing. She did have people like a Teresa and a Dino and a Felix that did want to keep her around. She also was part of the Tevin blindside and later the Sheamus blindside as well. And she also comes up with an idea to blindside Steffy in a plurality vote. And it's like, again, I do think there are aspects of Pinet's game that are pretty strong, but I think at the end of the day, a player that I just cannot imagine winning the game, and because of that, she still lands here number 19. Now, number 18, we're moving on to a player that I really want to put higher, but I think when we're looking at the actual game that was played, I just simply can't, and that person is Sheamus. And Sheamus is a person that I think when you just look at him, you would think that he would be a solid Survivor player. He is a player that seems pretty well-rounded. I mean, he's a very strategic figure, mind you, overly strategic to the point where I think that is one of the things that puts a target on his back. But Sheamus, to me here, plays a very similar game to another player that we will be talking about later on the list. However, I do think there are some major differences between this and the other person that do knock Sheamus down. I think the fact that Sheamus comes into the season as a former first boot. And through that, I just don't think he had that much of a target on his back coming in the season. And the fact that he does still end up becoming one of the bigger targets on the pre-merger side of things is a bit of a knock there. I do think you also have to knock him for his actively bad gameplay in the round that he goes home, to where he decides to flip on Dino and try to organize the votes against him, which, I mean, to be fair, is the initial thought process that I think most people would go through. But through doing so, he actually ends up furthering the chance of him going home, with Dino actually being one of the only people that wanted to keep him around. And he thinks he has the votes of Shona and Killarney, but both of them just rat him out right away. And I do think there is a level of overconfidence with Sheamus that is a knock for him. There's obviously the blatantness of his threat level that is also a bit of a knock for him. And really, there's not really a single round of the game that he plays that well. I mean, even the first round where he goes to the outpost, he ends up kind of ostracizing the post-mergers and kind of wastes opportunities to make relationships there. Even Teresa mentioned his lack of tact at that point. I mean, the only time he votes correctly the entire season is a position where he had an idol that he had to use in that one specific round. The other time he goes to travel for his boot, he's blindsided. So again, like, there's not much to really prop up there. And because I have to have him here 18. Now, number 17, we're moving on to a player that I just simply don't think had a chance on this season. And because that, it's tough to put him at the very bottom, but also he's the first boot, so I can't put him too high, and that is Chappies. I got Chappies for me. I just think I had no shot on this season. Mind you, I do think he did things that didn't help his game, but I think this is very much a Tony from Survivor Game Changers sort of situation where they're coming into the season with such a massive target on the back, and they know the target that's on their back. So instead of trying to downplay their target, which will almost never work, they decide to go all out instead and do more of what they did last time. And obviously it doesn't work out, but again, I don't know what would have worked out for Chappies here. Again, he had such a massive target on his back. I don't think there was really any way that he was making it beyond the early merge phase of the game unless he went out again. Now again, like, he was initially part of the Breakfast Club Alliance, which I actually credit him. I was surprised he was even able to get into that to begin with. And the fact that, like, Dante ends up flipping the vote against him seems to be more so based on emotional reasons, where he caught Chappies and Steffy digging in the middle of the night and was upset that he wasn't the one digging with them, which just seemed kind of ridiculous. But again, we see like Tony and PKB on board with this plan. I think that's almost solely due to the threat level that he had and also the reputation that he had. And like, I just think, like, at the end of the day, again, like, I can't rate him too high, but I also, like, can't rate him at the very bottom just due to the fact that I feel like he didn't do that much wrong here, and a lot of it's just based off of his previous reputation. So for me, he's here at 17. Number 16, moving on to kind of a similar case, but not as extreme. At 16, we do have PK. Now, PK is an interesting case here because, like, he's not someone like a Chappies where he had such a massive target on his back just inherently. However, I do think PK had a big target on his back because of the fact that he was on the same cast with Tevin and Tony. These two people that everyone knew that he was extremely close to, and he was on the same tribe as Tony here. And once Tony and PK got out of the numbers, and considering his not great relationship with Marion from outside the game, I do think everything just kind of converged to PK being the easy target on the board at this point. But kind of like Chappies, I don't know how much to really fault him in the game for this. Like, I don't think he necessarily does that much wrong here, outside of simply just not having the numbers. Like, I don't think he plays anything actively bad along the way, but also is just, like, not really in the best position to begin with. And like when he is voted out, he does have 4 people voting with him. He does at least have a backing there. It has the alliance with Tony, had a relationship with Palessa. Tajin was along with them. Again, like, it's not like he was completely dead in the water if he were to survive that round. So for me, again, it's just like a slightly better version of Chappies. Again, kind of a different target on his back, but still had a target nonetheless, and probably had more potential moving forward in the game than Chappies. So again, for me, he's 1 spot higher here at 16. Now, number 15, moving on to a player that I will say, if it was not for the fact that this person got taken out due to a very wonky vote, this person would have been much lower on the list. However, at 15, I do have Shona. Now again, Shona is mainly this high because she gets voted out pretty much by accident. I mean, she gets voted out because Dino plays his idol and Phil switches his vote. If the plan had gone through and had even gone through in what Phil wanted to actually happen in an ideal world, Shona would obviously be saved there and Dante would have been blindsided instead. However, instead here, she ends up being blindsided, which again, I think is very unlucky that all these things kind of converge to lead up to her eventual boot. Though I will also say that she was the initial target anyway. I mean, she was the person that the majority of that tribe wanted out, and really if she were to be saved, it would have been due to vote split and then an idol, so even that's like kind of wonky in its own right. But also, she didn't really play that well early on either. I mean, she's left on the outs of the Tevin vote in a situation where they very much could have involved her. I mean, she did have relationships with Phil and Dino, who seem to be 2 of the major orchestrators of that move, yet she's still left out of the plans there. She does end up ratting out Sheamus to Dino, leading up to the Sheamus boot, but at the same time, I don't even know if that was really in her best interest. Though I guess, like, considering her pregame relationship with Dino and then also her not really trusting Sheamus, I guess it makes sense. But even then, it's really just throwing a potential ally under the bus there. And again, we have her questionable decision to go to Yontao at the swap, which again, like I already talked about in my review, it makes sense. Like, I get why she does it. Where, again, her 2 closest allies are Dino and Phil, who are both on that tribe, and also by doing so, it makes it so they're not automatically going home, as they technically can save themselves with an idol at that point, because they can't split the vote. But it's still a very questionable decision, especially in terms of her own longevity in the game. But again, like, it is due to the fact that her actual boot round was a very wonky one, to where she really shouldn't have been the boot in that round if everything had gone according to plan. Though even then, I mean, I think you can call out the fact that she doesn't end up using the fake idol as part of the reason why Phil doesn't end up going along with the plan. So again, I mean, it is a very rocky game, but I did decide to put her above the likes of PK and Chappies, mainly because of how weird the circumstances of her getting taken out here were. And now number 14, we're having the top of the early boots here. I think came in with a massive target on their back. And here we do have Tevin. And straight up, I don't know how much wrong Tevin really did. Where, for me, like, I do think Tevin came in this season with a massive target on his back. I do think out of any of the pre-mergers, I think Tevin was the biggest target there, had the biggest reputation, and through that, I think was always going to be a target. Now, again, I think he is in a situation where he didn't help his cause, to where he does pretty much take the leadership role of the tribe, and no matter how much he tries to not look like the leader, he is still looking like the leader, and that is obviously something to knock him for there. But outside of that, like, I really don't think he did that much wrong here. I mean, he really just was in a position where Dino was able to consolidate his power, having the relationships with Phil and Felix, but also having Pinet and Teresa, and them all also recognizing how big of a threat Tevin was, to where he ends up being blindsided here. Again, like, I don't think there's that much wrong. Again, obviously he had an idol in his pocket. He could have used it. But I really don't feel like that's a thing to really change a person's ranking on a player ranking too much. If anything, prop it up in the sense that they were able to find the idol to begin with. But really, we've seen the best of players be blindsided with advantages in their pocket, and I really don't feel like that's a major knock against Tevin here. But I do think his pregame persona definitely wasn't great, of him already being looked at as this hyper-strategic player, and then also with him having the likes of Tony and PK on their other side, I do think they looked at him as a dangerous figure because of that. But I just don't feel like he did that much wrong in the actual game itself, so for me, he lands here at 14. Now, number 13, we're moving on to the final early boot on the board, as after this, we really jump around in placements quite a bit. But at 13, one of the last pre-mergers, we do have Teresa. And I feel like Teresa played much better than I expected to coming into this season. Mind you, I do think this is a season that greatly benefited her more than her previous season. But considering the fact that on her previous season, she gets voted out in the first opportunity that she could have, in a position where she never got the chance to vote anyone out, and also actively sabotages her own chances of staying at every opportunity, she played better than that this time. Again, like, I do think she is essentially Pinty if Pinty wasn't as emotional of a figure as she was, and didn't have as low of a win equity as she did. I mean, Teresa was pretty much playing a similar game. We're again very strategically minded, made the same moves as Pinty, again, still was part of the vote that flip against Tevin, was part of the Sheamus blindside, ends up being blindsided along with Pinty when Pinty goes home, and then ends up being taken out herself immediately afterwards. Again, it's a very similar game to Pinty, but this is essentially Pinty's game, had Pinty not had all the issues of being Pinty. But even beyond that, I feel like Teresa played her final round pretty well. I feel like the bond that she was able to build with Tajin, to the point where Tajin openly admits in confessional that he does want to keep her around, is really good. Now, obviously, we do still have the choice of her not deciding to vote for Felix, which could have potentially saved her there. But again, for me personally, I don't consider that major of a knock, as really at the end of the day, it's like, I feel like I would have done the same thing. I mean, again, it's kind of the Phil decision that he made at the Shona vote, where obviously he does decide to vote against Shona, but obviously later regrets it because of his vote for Shona, he ruins the plan to blindside Dante. That could have been the very similar case for Teresa if she actually did have Tajin on her side. If she did end up voting for Felix, that would have ruined the plan there to blindside Killarney. And I can get where she was coming from with that decision, even from a game standpoint, to where I don't really knock her too much for that. So overall, I feel like Teresa played a solid game here, especially considering her placement, and ends up being the best of these traditional pre-mergers here. But now we're moving on to number 12, where again, from this point on, the rest of the list does include players that, if not made the merge, then at least made the mergatory twist. And for me, the clear bottom of the players that did make the merge for me ends up having to be Killarney. And I did struggle exactly where to put Killarney, where I think my initial thought was to put her lower on the list, considering a couple factors. I mean, the big one being obviously the fact that everyone acknowledged her as a GOAT from very early on, and she just really had no chance of ever winning this game. So because that, I did consider initially, like, maybe she should be where Tanya's and Pinty's are. But realistically, again, like, she made 5th place. Like, that is a really deep run in the game. And while she was delusional along the way and thinking that she was making moves when she really wasn't, and did get blindsided by a couple votes, she was still pretty involved in the gameplay that happened on the post-swap tribe, where she bonds with Steffy, and I do think there she was actually playing kind of well considering her position. She's also one of the people that rats out Sheamus along with Shona as a self-preservation move, which I do think was overall a better move for Killarney than it was for Shona, considering Killarney was in a lot more danger at that point. And again, post-merge, she's really just going along with the numbers for a lot of it. Again, getting blindsided the Steffy vote, even though she wants Steffy to go, but does get picked up by the Shane, Marion, Dino contingent. Now, obviously, the massive flaw in all this is the fact that despite that, she still isn't even taken to the end. Despite being this massive GOAT that everyone recognized that they would have beaten, they still don't take her to Final 2, which for the likes of someone like a Shane in particular is such a massive knock, where even he acknowledged that she was his best path to a win, and he still doesn't take that, which for Killarney to not even secure that relationship, which is obviously a knock that we'll talk about for him, but is also a knock for Killarney here, in her not getting people to do what's in their own best interest at that point. And for me, Killarney is kind of a double-edged sword here, of a player that, again, had such longevity in the game, again, got 5th place, but just had no win equity the entire time. But again, I think in comparison to the last person we talked about in Teresa, she does technically outplay Teresa in her boot round. To where for Tajin, it was a choice between Teresa and Killarney. He did end up siding with going with Killarney. So for me, that was definitive enough to where I feel like Killarney should have been at least this high on the list. But in comparison to everyone else that we're about to be talking about, I feel like Killarney was just such a GOAT in the game here, to where I just could not justify putting her much higher, and because that she's here at number 12. Now at number 11, we're moving on to a player that is also kind of conflicting in the sense that they did have some control at parts of the game, but I do think they mismanaged that control. And at 11, we do have Tony. Now, Tony for me is still a very competent player. I think Tony is a player with a decent strategic mind, and we see that right away with her being one of the spearheads of the Chappies vote, though immediately afterwards she has the game flipped on her during the PK vote. And immediately after that, I do feel like she handles that entire situation really poorly. I mean, her further stoking this rivalry with Dante is really just poor gameplay, and she would have been the next boot from that tribe had they ever gone to tribal, with even the likes of Tajin flipping against her, so that's all pretty bad. But once she gets to the swap, she's able to get herself into a pretty good position where, again, the entire post-swap section of the game, she has a lot of control. The problem is that, again, I feel like she mismanages that control, largely due to the fact that she has this really good relationship with Steffy, and Steffy was never really working with her, but she was able to convince Tony to keep her around and do things that were in Steffy's best interest. And through that, while Tony had a lot of control and was in the swing position for a lot of that post-swap section of the game, she ends up making decisions that don't end up benefiting her game. And even the solid move that she does make along the way in giving the idol to Dino, even that doesn't even end up really gaining her Dino's trust by the end of it, to where Dino just easily flips against her at the merge vote anyway. And also her bowing down and letting Palessa go also is really bad, and pretty much just sealed her fate as the merge boot after that. Though I will say that supposedly she did whisper to Dino to play the idol on Palessa, which would have been greatly beneficial at that point, but wasn't able to get that through either. And again, I think it's a very mixed bag of a game. It's a game that has a lot of rocky moments where she is seeming like an emotional player and not really making the moves that's in her best interest, but there are also points where she is leading the vote and she is showing a lot of agency in the game. So again, like, it is a conflicting game for me, but I did end up landing here at number 11. Now, number 10, we're moving on to a player that I think by the end of the season does come off in a very doofusy way, but again, I do think there are strong moments here and there of this person's game. And at number 10, we do have Tajin. And Tajin, for me, really ends up being higher than Tony here due to longevity. I do think there is actually probably a debate for Tony being higher on the list than Tajin. However, I do feel like, one, Tajin obviously made it a bit further in the game, and through that ends up being part of some pretty important votes immediately after the Tony vote. But even outside that, I do think Tajin had the better strategic read on the game during the post-swap section of the game, though he doesn't fully enact on that, which is obviously an issue still. Early on, again, he is kind of attached to the Season 6 group at the post-merge tribe, though does end up being down in numbers when PK is blindsided. Though after that, does go into full self-preservation mode and throws Tony under the bus, and also builds a really strong relationship with Shane. So again, like, I do think he plays that as well as he could have. After a swap, again, he is working alongside Tony, and where they are making moves that are more beneficial towards Steffy than they are for themselves. To where, despite being pulled into this 4-person alliance with Felix and Teresa, and still wanting to work with Dino after a merge, who is someone that is working with Felix and Teresa, they still decide to end up blindsiding Felix and Teresa, which just seemed like a very misguided move there. Though again, like, it did seem like Tajin seemed to recognize the importance of keeping around Teresa, though doesn't end up going through with it. And the same thing goes with the eventual Palessa boot, where Tajin seemed to recognize that this is dumb for my game to get rid of Palessa, but doesn't actually do anything to truly stop it there. And immediately after a merge, he is blindsided by the Tony vote, though again, immediately after that, he is pulled in at the last second to vote out Dante, also ends up voting out Steffy, which end up being two of the bigger moves of the season. Though after that, is obviously blindsided by the Merrell vote, and then his actual boot round is just a comedy of errors where his entire fake idol ploy was just really moronic, if I'm being honest. I mean, him using the idol in that situation where he knows that the votes are split between him and Felix does the complete opposite of what he wants it to do. Again, like, the pretending that you have an idol is only effective in a situation where the opposition can't split the vote, because at that point they don't want to vote for someone and that idol being played successfully. However, in a situation like this where they're splitting the vote, instead this does the opposite in making them want to vote for you instead so that they can get rid of your idol, whether that be through you playing it or through voting you out. And the fact that Tajin does this plan is what actually seals his fate, which is a very terrible way for him to go. And again, for me, it's like, this is really bad. I do think there's an argument for Tony being higher than Tajin, almost solely due to how bad this one individual move is. But I do think there are points in the game where Tajin had a better read on the game, and he also had more longevity. And I really did feel like there was at least some semblance of a path for him to get to the end, though realistically, it's like how much win equity do you really have even if he got there? And he also sabotaged his own path to the end anyway. But again, like it's a very rocky game. For me, it's here at number 10. Now at number 9, we're moving on to a player that, I'll be honest, like I don't think at the end of the day played that great of a game, largely due to the fact that this person's threat level was so massive that there was no way this person was getting to the end. But considering the fact that they were out in front and still was able to make a deep run this season, also have some moves to their mantle, I do have to have at number 9 here, Dante. And again, for me, Dante is someone that I really just feel like he completely mishandled his threat level, to where he is the main orchestrator behind the Chappies boot, and that is something to give him credit for. But that move also gets rid of one of his biggest meat shields, to the point where through that and getting rid of PK and like really just making himself look like the alpha male figure on the tribe, he's just putting this massive target on his back, to where by the time of the merge, it just felt like an inevitability that he would be eventually taken out. And really, he would have been at multiple points on the season up to that point, where we had the Shona boot, where at that point, Dino comes very close to idling him out of the game. Had it not been for Phil backing out of the plan at the last second, Dante would have gone home there. We also have the Palessa boot, where, again, this is another point where I will have to give credit to Dante, where Dante does impressively lie about a fake idol that ends up being really effective there. But had it not been for that, Dante would have been a very likely boot in that round as well. And the negatives for Dante's game really just all comes down to the massive lack of threat management, and also just how obvious he is with the game that he's playing. And through that, he was always destined to be a boot around the point of the game that he got taken out there, but there were still some impressive moves that he made along the way, in completely breaking up the Breakfast Club alliance and taking out one of its members, only to be able to reform the alliance the very next day, is kind of insane. And then again, the fake auto play was pretty strong as well, but again, it's the fact that he was always pretty much doomed by the time he makes the merge that makes it tough to really place him too much higher, especially considering he never really had direct control in the game after the swap, where despite how much he wanted to get Dino out of the game, he was still not able to get the votes onto him. So again, all those things are knocks for me, to where he does land here at number 9. Now number 8, we're moving on to a player that is the earliest boot left on the board, and this is a player that I think at the end of the day kind of gets screwed over by a twist here and by the format of the season, and that person ends up being Palessa. That is a large reason why she's as high as she is here, because like really on paper, her game is a pretty big mixed bag. Again, early on, she technically is part of the group that votes out Chappies, but she's also part of the group that gets blindsided by the PK vote. And while she does the best of the outsiders at that point and integrating themselves within the Breakfast Club, she's still technically on the outs at that point. And she gets swapped into a very beneficial position that allows her to really just play both sides and really just falls her way into the perfect scenario of the Dante blindside failing and Shona being taken out instead, which allows her to play this double agent role between the two, with her actually gaining more trust from Dante after that move, despite the fact that she actually wanted him out, which I don't think that was actually in her best interest at that point. Though again, I think the way that she ends up being taken out of the game is really just due to unlucky circumstances. And really just so much had to go wrong in her boot round for her to eventually go home. Again, like first up, the entire Masu tribe was immune in a tribal where everyone was voting. You also have to add in the fact that Dino had a public idol. Everyone assumed that Dante had an idol. Phil was assumed to have an advantage from the outpost. Shane was lying about an idol. And Marion actually had a tribal council pass, meaning that Palessa was the only person on the board that had no level of protection there. And to go even further beyond that, a lot of the target being put on her back was done at Tribal, where a decent amount of figures didn't seem to fully figure out what was actually going on until Tribal, to where they didn't really have enough time to fully plot to counter that plan. And I do think those are all very unlucky circumstances for Palessa here, to where I do have to rank her a bit higher than I normally would because that, and also the fact that, again, like, I don't think she goes home unless this mergatory twist happens. If this had just been a normal merge round, I do think it's probably someone like Tony that goes home instead, but because Palessa was one of the few vulnerable players on the board, it just made her such a ripe target to be taken out at that point. But again, I feel like that's largely due to a lot of unlucky circumstances. So while her game up to that point was very middling with a lot of ups and downs, I do think the fact that she gets very unlucky in the round that she actually ends up going home has to rank her above certain people that outlasted her, and because that, for me, she lands here number 8. Now number 7, and now we're pretty much down to the end gamers here. At number 7, we have a person that I think is one of the bigger threats on the board to win the game had they gotten to the end, but was a decent ways off of getting there, and that person is Merrell. And for me, Merrell is a tough one to assess here in the sense that, again, her win equity was so large. However, the path to the end there was simply just not there. And really all that comes down to a massive lack of threat management. I mean, the fact that she was so blatantly looked at as such a massive threat from early on is obviously an issue there. And a lot of that comes from the fact that she loses her shield in Dante, which, again, she had actively been trying to make that move for a while, which I just simply do not agree with her wanting to take out Dante, as it really just opened it up for, one, her being the biggest threat left on the board, to where her own alliance turns on her at that point, but also it gives her one less number in the game, to where, yes, Dante is someone that is a bit tough to work with and is someone that is always going to be associated with you, to where if they do go for Dante, they're going to split the votes on you. To me, I feel like the risk was still worth it for Merrell, especially in the situation where a lot of the people who assume that she was super close to Dante are people that are already out of the game, or at least on their way out, in the likes of a Tajin at that point. So I do think taking out Dante there did seem like a misstep for me, and I do think that greatly factors into her increased threat level by the time she becomes the biggest target on the board. But even within that, I mean, obviously she gets saved at the Steffy vote, where No BS Alliance ends up flipping the game there, and she gets taken out immediately afterwards in a round where, again, it's portrayed that she makes one of the dumbest moves of all time by playing the Tribal Council pass incorrectly and everything. But to me, I don't look at it as that bad of a move, especially considering the spot she's already in at that point. Again, she's in a spot where she would need to win out or have an alliance that she fully trusts at that point, and without an alliance at that point, the path to the end is almost non-existent, and I do think she had to put her trust in somebody, and it's just the fact that she didn't have her trust reciprocated. But I don't have much of an issue with her gameplay that round, considering I just feel like she played for longevity more so than short-term safety. But again, like, I do think for a lot of the early games she was playing very well. I mean, she was part of the Breakfast Club and also the full package, which was really the core of the game. I mean, it was the group that was running the game. And while I do think she, at the end of the day, was probably the least integral member of those three, she still ends up being in a very strong position for a lot of the early game. So again, it's still a game that has a lot of ups and downs, with the massive negative being the lack of threat management, but had massive win equity and was well positioned early on. So for me, it's enough to land her here at number 7. At number 6, we're moving on to the first member of the No BS Alliance that we're going to be talking about, and that person ends up being Felix. And Felix is a tough member to assess for me, and I think part of that is because I still don't have a great sense of how he would have done in a jury vote, so I feel like that will play a factor in his placement. But without that information, I did leave him at 6 here. Again, for me, he's part of the No BS Alliance. I think you should fully credit him for the Steffy move. We do see him do all the work for that move and also come with the concept of the move. And with that being probably the biggest move of the entire season, I do think overall, very impressive move on his end. And should have put him in a game-winning position for making that move, though it doesn't seem like it does. It does feel like even after making that move, the likes of Dino and Phil are still looked at as the bigger threats to win the game, while Felix is still like not that well positioned in his own right. And really, I think that is the greatest flaw of Felix for me, is that position-wise, he is simply just not as well positioned as Dino and Phil throughout any portion of the game, which obviously factors into why immediately after the No BS Alliance breaks up that he is the first one to go. I mean, he is the one that doesn't have a relationship with the Shane and Marion contingent. He did seem to try to build relationships with Shane and Tajin, though neither of those end up sticking. I do think in general, like, while he does get credit for pulling off the Merrell blindside, for me that was just a bad move from his point of view, where I think Felix was the person that was the most reliant on the No BS Alliance, and through getting rid of Merrell, it really just opened up the No BS Alliance to be broken up moving forward. Where for him, he really should have been trying to solidify that power structure, to where even then, like, it probably would have been a tough road for him to win, but still would have given him longevity in the game instead of just being on the outs during the final 6 and final 7 rounds. Also, the fact that he gets blindsided by Tajin and Tony at the swap, where despite them coming in with the numbers, they really just mess everything up and aren't able to keep the numbers on their side, and barely even squeaks his way to the merge at that point. In really early game, he just kind of there. I mean, he seems to be aligned with Phil, but both of them kind of just let Tanya go in a position where they wanted to use her as a number. And Felix is really the least integral in the Tevin vote, where he's the one that has to be convinced by everyone else to go along with the Tevin vote. So again, like, for me, I feel like Felix is a player that was a bit too passive at points early in the game, was simply just not as well positioned as the other players around him, though at the same time pulled off some really massive moves, namely the Steffy blindside, that for me has to prop him up a bit. But I think in comparison to these other players that were much better positioned than him, I can't really put him higher than them, and because that, he is here at number 6. Now number 5, and again, for me, this is a tough placement because this is a person that I think his placement could change based on some more news that we find out moving forward. But as of right now, at number 5, I do have Shane, the runner-up of the season, and Shane is a figure here that I don't know how many winning scenarios he really had. Now, no matter what, he would still be around this placement, considering, again, he is the runner-up of the season. He did get 2nd place, and he had a very blatant winning scenario at the final 5, where if he got into the end of Killarney, he very blatantly wins the game. And that is something to be applauded. The problem is that I don't know how many other scenarios he wins the game. Like, I know for sure he loses to Marion, Phil, and obviously to Dino. Felix, I think it would have been kind of close. I assume he probably beats Tajin, but even then, we're getting pretty far back into the game, and I don't think he beats Merrell or Steffy. So really, it's just his win equity, I do think, is very questionable. But that being said, like, I don't think he plays the worst game in the world, but also has a lot of rocky moments within the game. Obviously, his first round is very janky, where while he does form the Breakfast Club in that round, that Breakfast Club also breaks up by the end of that round, to where the vote is being split on him and Chappies, and he really plays extremely hard in that round to try to put the votes on Dante and ends up completely failing at that and almost gets sent home. So that's a really bad round, but afterwards the Breakfast Club is able to get back together and really just run the show until the merge, and through that Shane is kind of just riding alongside them. We don't really see Shane being a major figure within that alliance, but he does seem to build strong social bonds along the way, though at the same time we do eventually see him at the swap try to be this double agent to Phil and Dino, and them just not buying a single inch of it. And we see them rat him out to Palessa, which could have potentially backfired on him. But then come into the merge, there's obviously these bigger threats in the game over him, and while he is blindsided at the Steffy vote, he really stays in the majority from that point forward. But again, it's a situation where he had such a blatant winning scenario and he just simply doesn't take it, despite the fact that he was the swing vote in that scenario. If Shane flips at the final 5, Dino goes home and he is in a much better position to potentially win the game, with at that point Marion very likely to take him to the end. He also has Killarney as his win scenario and has Phil in the situation where he still has to take out Marion at that point. But he doesn't make the move there, which is just such a questionable decision in my eyes, and really just has to leave him this low here, to where despite him having the win scenario right in front of him, he doesn't take that opportunity and gets to a final 4 situation where he was pretty much dead in the water. And because of that, for me, he lands here number 5. Now number 4, we're moving on. to the earliest boot left on the board, and here we do have Steffy. And for me, Steffy really impressed me on this season. I really came in this season not thinking Steffy had much potential in the game, and she really ends up surprising me here. While she does end up being blindsided at the very first tribal where Chappies goes home, again, after the Breakfast Club reforms and she's able to also be part of the full package, that grouping really dominates the game up until the Steffy boot. And despite her being swap screwed, put into a position where she's left without any of her allies, she's able to pick up new allies in that position to make her the best position player in the game, now having allies on both sides of the field, where she picks up Killarney as a solid final 2 for her. She has Tony and Tajin deciding to side with her in a position where, again, they are making moves that are not good for their games, instead good for Steffy's game. We also hear about a strong relationship between Steffy and Felix, to where that's impressive as well. And with her also having the connections with Marion and Merrell and Shane and Dante on the other side, she is really just perfectly positioned coming into the merge, where the only people she doesn't have any relationship with are Dino and Phil, who are on the outskirts at that point. The problem is that I do feel like Steffy was a bit too passive strategically. Like, while she does do a masterful job socially on this season, much better than I ever expected her to, I do think she left a lot of the strategy to Marion, to where we do see her just kind of going along with plans like getting Tony out and getting Dante out, which I think are two moves that were completely against her best interests, and also in the eventual Merrell boot being something that really just opens up the game for No BS to flip the game on her. I really feel like she makes some poor decisions in her last few rounds on who exactly to target, where I do feel like for her game in particular, she should have been trying to put the target onto Dino and Phil, but instead was allowing them to stay in the game to the point where they eventually end up gaining the numbers to flip the game on her. So again, for me, that is a pretty massive flaw in Steffy's game, but it's still the impressiveness of her social game up to her boot in the position where, like, she has to essentially be sniped out of the game. Again, it is a 5-4 vote. If they didn't get her out in that round, it would have been very difficult to get her out moving forward, with her having Shane and Marion moving in lockstep with her, and her also having an idol in her pocket. So again, for her masterful positioning in the game and the fact that she had to be taken out in a very precise scenario, I do have her here at number 4. Now number 3, and now we're on to the big 3. I mean, for me, this season was pretty much dominated in screen time by 3 major characters, and those 3 people end up being the top 3 on the player ranking here. And at number 3, we're going with the lowest placing figure of those 3 anyway, and that person is Phil. And Phil is a person here that, to me, plays such a good game up until the final 7, only for him to sabotage his own game at that point, and his entire game crumbles after that. Where I will say that I do think Phil played the best game up until the final 7 round. He is a person that in the original pre-merge tribe, while he wasn't as well positioned as Dino, he obviously had the relationship with Dino through the No BS Alliance, and through that, and also Dino's connections with Teresa and Pinet, they were able to pull off the blindside on Tevin, which is a very impressive move, and a move that actually benefits Phil more than anyone else, considering it's been revealed after the fact that Tevin had been coming for Phil. So that ends up being a pretty good move for him. An impressive aspect of Phil's game that I think in comparison to Dino makes me have him having played the post-swap better is the fact that Dino was always the target in the post-swap over Phil, to where there was never really a point where they considered taking Phil out, with the likes of Shona and Dino being targets ahead of him. Now, I will also say that this is also where he does make the mistake of flipping his vote that causes Shona to go home, but at the same time, I can get the merit of the vote considering he is in self-preservation mode at that point, and through flipping his vote there, it does secure himself another day, so it's like, I can kind of get it, though obviously it would have been optimal if he didn't end up flipping his vote there. But moving forward, I mean, we really just see him play alongside the majority for a while. We do see him create this plan with Tony to blindside Shane, though it doesn't end up going through. Instead, he just goes along with voting out Palessa, and then Tony, and then Dante. But throughout a lot of this, it is his relationship with Marion that, to be fair, is a pre-game relationship, but it is that relationship that seems to give him this edge in the game that makes him still in the loop, despite the fact that he is technically an outsider at that point. But again, at the final 9, Felix comes to him with the plan to blindside Steffy, and No BS really makes the most out of that opportunity, pulling off a really incredible blindside on Steffy at that point. completely flipping the power structure. But then we have the Marion vote immediately afterwards, which I will say for Phil and Dino in particular, I do think is a better move than it is for Felix, who for Felix, he really need no BS to stick together to have any chance at winning the game, while Phil and Dino both had the connection with Shane and Marion. That would have gotten them the 4 anyway. So again, it's not as integral for Phil to keep Merrell in the game, though I do still think for Phil it is a bit of a misstep considering threat level. So we're moving forward, Phil is looked at as one of the bigger threats on the board, while Merrell would have been an easy shield for him. But really, again, like for me at the final 7s where Phil's game really just crumbles, like I really feel like he plays those rounds disastrously, where he does the worst of both worlds. He still sides with the final 4 of Dino, Shane, and Marion, which is not really in his best interest. It's really a grouping that doesn't favor him, where he has 2 massive jury threats going alongside him in Dino and Marion, and also has people there that aren't going to take him to the end. So that route isn't ideal for him, but for him to go with that route, but also along the way burn trust with the people on that side through his obsession over finding the idol and lying to people about the clue, it really just leads to him being further pushed on the outs, and then eventually he ends up saving Felix through flipping his vote to vote out Tajin, which seemed to be a complete accident from his end in terms of him not really wanting to save Felix, but more so wanting to get rid of Tajin, which through doing so ends up further ruining his relationship with his alliance, to where at that point he's completely on the outs and has to essentially win out from that point forward, to which he eventually gets voted out of 4. And again, a lot of that is his own doing. He really plays those rounds terribly. However, it is the strength of his game up until that point that does leave him at number 3 here, especially considering I do still feel like he would have had decent win equity if he were gotten to N. Now, I don't know exactly if he would have beaten like a Dino. I feel pretty confident he would have lost against Marion, but either way, I mean, he still had win scenarios by that point in the game and going against Shane or Killarney. And really, Phil, for me, again, like has a very rocky game, has a very strong first 2/3 of it, but it really just crumbles by the end. But for me, it's enough to be here at number 3. Now, number 2, and for me, the top 2 here are really definitive. I mean, as you can tell, and the order for me was also pretty simple. I do think had the outcome of the season been something slightly different, maybe you could have swapped the 2 placements. However, with the way the season played out, at number 2, I do have to solidly have Marion. And for me, this isn't really a question at this point. I mean, I do feel like Marion has to be at number 2 for me, to where despite her having the biggest amount of win equity on the board, where it seemed like any jury vote would have given her the win, with her being looked at as like the strategic force of the season and also having so many personal bonds that kept her safe throughout the game. The problem is none of those bonds actually plan on taking her to 2. And in a game with a final 2, which was announced at the very beginning of the game, meaning everyone had to play under the context of a final 2, the fact that Marion never really solidified any true final 2s, especially out of people that were in the end game, is a massive knock for me. I mean, again, like really her only true final 2 across the season was Steffy, someone booted in the final 9 round. And really from that point forward, no one left on the board was taking her to the end outside of maybe Shane, and even then, don't really know. Now, to be fair to Marion, she did get Shane to 3, and did do work to get Shane to 3, which was her best chance of not needing to win final immunity. So again, that is credit to give to her, but at the same time, the fact that she had so many people there acknowledge how big of a threat she was and weren't willing to take her to the end is a mismanagement of her threat level, and one that is very deadly for a player like Marion, who doesn't seem like a person that is that likely to win final immunity. That being said, again, she did play a really strong game. I mean, while she does let Chappies go in the first round, she does eventually reorganize the Breakfast Club and puts herself in the center of the Breakfast Club through forming the full package and also the final 2 with Steffy. That puts her in a really strong position at that point, and flips the game on PK. And after a swap, again, she's still in a solid position. Now, at the same time, she is technically out of loop on the Shona vote, where there were so many things going on around her that she just really didn't know about. But still, it doesn't come back to bite her. The Palessa vote is one that I can give her a lot of credit for. I think her, along with Merrell, were major instigators of that, and she ends up using her diplomatic immunity to give that information to the other side to make that plan fully come together. And then after a merge, and we see the Breakfast Club hold the numbers and take out Tony. We see them take out Dante, which I will say, again, for me, the Dante move is still pretty bad. I don't think that was the right move for Marion to make at that point. It really just opened up the game for the No BS Alliance to flip the game on her, which they end up doing when they take out Steffy. Again, she gets blindsided the Steffy vote, loses her closest ally, who had an idol with her as well. I think that all that is pretty bad. Beyond that, again, she is in full control, and I do think that is really impressive that she's able to rebuild this relationship with Dino and Phil and get them to have a Final Four with Shane. And while Phil ends up being a loose can moving forward, I mean, her relationship with Dino and Shane ends up being one that gets her all the way to Final Three, with her being the central figure of that group, again, the biggest jury threat of that group, and also being the main strategic figure of that group. Though I will say again, I do find some missteps in the fact that she votes out Killarney over Dino. Now, I can get it at the time of wanting Killarney out, especially considering Killarney was someone that didn't have the greatest relationship with Marion. However, I do feel like Marion should have been under the mindset that she needed to win final immunity, or to have Shane win final immunity, which having Killarney there instead of Dino would have been a much better position for her. So again, a bit iffy on that decision, and again, really she's just leading herself up to be in a Final Three scenario where no one is going to take her to 2, which is a knock against her for me. But again, like, she does still come very close to winning the game. I mean, she is literally one competition from winning the game in a pretty dominant fashion. And even then, if Shane had won immunity, I do think there is a serious chance that she's able to convince him to take her as well. So again, I do have nitpicks with her game. I do think there are things to point out of things that she could have certainly done better, but overall it is a very strong game. But at the end of the day, I do think she was outplayed by one certain player, so because that, she is here at number 2. Now number 1, the number 1 player on the South Africa Return of the Outcasts player ranking is the winner. We do have Dino, and for me, I do feel like Dino plays this season pretty optimally considering the hand he was dealt. Now, while again, like, he wasn't in control the entire way through, and I do think there are points where he is letting other people take the strategic forefront over him, he is still playing a very impressive game from beginning to end, especially considering the threat level that he had on his back, where despite him being a pre-merger, it seemed like the general consensus on him was the fact that he was such a massive super fan. He knew everything about the game, to where, again, we see the likes of Dante wanting to target him even before he even met Dino. And the fact that he's able to overcome all that is still very impressive. Now, again, I do think he is one of the players that probably benefited the most from pre-game, in the sense that he started a game with some decent relationships with Teresa and Pinet. I also believe he had relationships with people like a Tony and a Shona. So it's like he had pre-game relationships coming into the season. But again, for me, I never really considered that major of a knock against a person's game. And really early on here, he seems to be pretty well positioned on the original pre-merger tribe, where he really lets Tevin and Sheamus take the lead early on, while seeming to be building decent relationships, with Sheamus in particular seeming to be someone that's pretty close to him early on. He eventually flips the vote against Tevin and ends up being a central piece in that, and where he is part of the No BS Alliance, but also is the one that has the relationships with Teresa and Pinet to be a major instigator of that move. Also has the relationships with Killarney and Shona, to where they rat out Sheamus, to where when he decides to try to blindside Dino, he instantly gets word of that plan and blindsides Sheamus instead. But then he is given a really bad swap scenario where he is on the bottom. Again, he is in a 5-3 deficit, while also having Dante, someone that is so tunnel vision on taking him out. Yet despite that, he is able to survive this round. I mean, he has a situation where none of the women are willing to vote out Dino over Shona. And I think that alone shows you some pretty impressive social work that Dino was able to put in there. And despite that, he's able to find an idol and almost pull off what would have been one of the most insane moves of pulling off this massive blindside on Dante. And obviously Phil ends up backtracking on that at the last second, but still comes very close to pulling that off. Now, I will say that I think something that can be mentioned here is the fact that Dino needed that idol to stay in that round, though a very big counter to that, to where like that doesn't factor anything for me, is the fact that he put the votes onto himself. Like, he purposely told Palessa to vote for him so that he can use the idol successfully. So again, it's not really a major knock in the sense that he would have been voted out if it wasn't for the idol, as he wouldn't have had that many votes on him if it wasn't for the idol anyway. But beyond that, we do also have Tony giving him the idol that keeps him safe until the merge, which is a pretty impressive display of his relationship with Tony, which again, pre-game related, but still keeps him safe moving forward. And again, like for the early merge section of the game, he is really just like going along with what the majority is doing, voting out Palessa and Tony and Dante. But again, the Steffy move, very impressive work from the No BS Alliance. Now, I do think he was less integral in that move than someone like a Felix for sure, but still, very impressive move to pull off there, blindsiding Steffy. And then we get to the Merrell move, where that one really was more of a group effort, where he was part of convincing Merrell to use the Tribal Council pass. And also, I feel like he is the one of the No BS Alliance that benefits the most from voting out Merrell at that point, to where he does have the relationships with Shane and Marion to secure himself moving forward. Well, also, he acknowledges that he's on the bottom of the No BS Alliance. And really, that's another impressive aspect of Dino's game, is that he flips on the No BS Alliance really at the perfect time here, where through voting out Merrell, he takes out a big threat on the board for him, while also giving him an excuse to flip on the No BS Alliance, which was a power structure that didn't really benefit him, as at that point the No BS Alliance was down in numbers 4-3, but also him and Phil had a contingency plan outside of that also. So it's like, I do think really the Merrell move, while I do think for No BS as a whole was a bad move, I do think for Dino in particular ends up being a pretty solid move for him. And from that point forward, he's working in lockstep with Marion and Shane, initially with Phil, but later with Killarney. Again, the fact that he's able to get Marion and Shane to vote out Killarney over him is really insane to me. Where again, from the Marion and Shane contingent, they 100% should have been keeping Killarney around. The fact that Shane doesn't even just go rogue and keep Killarney around is insane to me. Really impressive work there. And from that point on, he has the perfect end game. He has these two big threats in front of him that need to be taken out, to where Marion or Phil were going home at 4 no matter what, and whoever remained at 3 was more likely going to be voted out as long as they didn't win immunity. And with Marion being very unlikely to win final immunity anyway, it really just puts Dino in a perfect position there to get to the final 2 with Shane to where he wins. And again, really for me, it is a very solid, consistent game from beginning to end. A game that I think he plays pretty optimally the entire road. It's just that he is being faced with a decent amount of adversity along the way that causes him to not really be in control the entire way. But despite that, I do think he plays the game very well here. And for me, in the debate between Dino and Marion, for me, the end-all be-all is that he cuts Marion at 3 and was just overall better positioned to get to final 2 to begin with. And through all those things, for me, Dino ends up being pretty solid as my number 1 on the Survivor SA Return of the Outcasts player ranking here. But there we go. I mean, that is the player ranking for the season, ending my coverage of Return of the Outcasts. Now, moving forward, I didn't mention this in my review that I do plan on doing a top 10 Survivor SA player list moving forward, updating that list. Don't know exactly when that will be, but it'll be sure before next season. So stay tuned for that. Obviously, whenever we get SA10, I'll cover that. We do have Survivor 43 coming up very soon, which I will also be covering. And also, we have other shows currently going on, like BB24 and the Challenge USA that I'll be doing videos of as well. So stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.